That is a beautiful, beautiful slice of brisket. Yo, what's going on, Noxiat fam? Welcome back for another video. In today's video, we are going to be going through a full brisket cook. If you guys didn't see my last video about going through the trimming process of the briskets that we're cooking today, make sure you check out that video before you watch this one. Right now, we just got a couple things that we had going. Currently, it's 7:15. I rolled out of bed around 6:15, 6:30-ish or so. First thing that I like to do, especially for brisket cooks, is I like to make sure that I get the fire nice and hot and make sure I make a really, really good coal bed. Literally, the very first thing I did this morning was start a fire, get some coals in there, threw a little extra just because I wanted a nice bigger coal bed, and then threw some wood on top of there. The second thing that I wanted to do is make sure I get these briskets out of the fridge. We're trying to temper them similar to the way you would do like a steak if you were doing it at home, but obviously these are really, really large chunks of meat, so it's not going to temper quite as much. I think it's nice to kind of pull them out, and then the surface starts to kind of get a little more wet, which allows the rub to stick on a little bit better. And right now, if I were to show you the temp gauges, they are well over 350 and like 325 on our gauges. I would say the most common mistake is that people start with a fire that's way, way too low. My recommendation is always to kind of make sure you start with a good coal bed. Whether that means that you're gonna add more coals to the coal bed to start, or you start a fire way hotter and just kind of like wait an hour to get those initial logs that you have and break them into coals. And in today's case, we're kind of doing both. Probably in the next hour, 45 minutes or so, we'll be able to see a really kind of like chunky coal bed for us to kind of really start that fire. And the reason why this is so important is because when you guys are initially starting to learn how to cook barbecue, I like to break it up into these two ideas of fire management. The coal bed is what's giving you the ambient heat. The logs that you're throwing on top and stacking on top is really there to kind of make sure that those coals stay alive and also add that smoke flavor. But you don't really want to be cooking your meat with just the heat from the logs itself. And what I mean by that is, you know, when you guys start a fire initially, and instead of coals, you use a torch. Stack up all the logs and you burn all the logs, and you can see all the air that's whipping around there. The flames are really, really animated. They're going crazy and they're all over the place. That is not a fire that you really want. You're getting all that convection that's happening just from those burning logs, and it's such an aggressive heat that's when you start to get crispy edges and drying out certain things. So for me, what I'm really looking for is a really big coal bed, enough splits in there to kind of keep the fire fed, as well as giving it enough smoke without stacking it too tall. All right, folks, this fire's been going probably about another hour or so, but you can see that the piece is about to break. In the bottom, we got those nice chunky coals, and we'll be able to break up the stuff up top. If I feel like, oops, look at that, perfect timing. We'll be maybe putting on, you know, two fresh new base logs and one that kind of goes at an angle like I show you guys. But after that, it's gonna be 1 to 2. And when it breaks down like this again, 3 at most. But that's it. That's gonna be kind of our structure for building a fire throughout today. All right, guys, before we start seasoning the briskets, we have to make the seasoning. So we're just using 16 mesh black pepper and then diamond crystal salt. I've talked about the reason why I go with the diamond crystal in a couple videos, but if you guys want a more detailed video about just talking about salt, I'll leave a video in the top corner for you guys to check out. Because I think it really is important to get that salt right. Certain methods lend itself better to Morton's or Diamond Crystal, and the method that we're going to be using today, I personally prefer the Diamond Crystal. I always tell people to go 50-50, but add a little bit more pepper just because that's what I like. And then at this point, you can also add a little bit of garlic if you guys want to go with Lowry's. I have absolutely nothing against Lowry's. Instead of using a shaker, do the Louis Miller / Leroy and Lewis method. I think it's just a little bit easier, and you know, using a shaker actually takes quite a bit of skill, which I think I have, but I also find that this one is much easier. So throw a lid on here. So with this seasoning, we have this pan. We're gonna drop a decent amount there. Now we just want to make sure that it's nice and even and level. We've been having this brisket sit out for a little bit, and it's starting to get a little more tacky, like I said. Binders, you can use mustard if you like. Generally, I just use water in a spritz bottle. This one's just apple cider vinegar, and if it's dry, I'll just give it a light spritz and then just dip it in there. All right, so we have this. Make sure you get all the edges. we just want to make sure that we cover up every single spot of this brisket in that seasoning. We're going to put this straight into the smoker. All right, guys, so the last thing that I want to show you guys before I close this smoker up is kind of placement of these briskets. Now, typically, when you're just doing one brisket, it kind of doesn't matter, but there's certain rules that I want to kind of think about, and it's not always going to happen, or you're not going to always have the right briskets for it. This area right here, closest to the edge, is kind of where that first slice of that moisten is going to happen. That's where kind of like the Texas burn end pieces are, and the one in the back wall, that part is on towards the back side of the wall. Around the door and that back wall, there might be some hot spots. Generally, that's where some of the hot spots can be on pits, and also generally hotter in the back, cool in the front. I got my smallest brisket here, the largest brisket back there. But as much as possible, I like to try to keep those first burn end chunks like towards either the front of the door or back wall, because it just kind of helps protect those edges a little bit more, because they're a little bit more fatty. Because this side right here is where we lopped off that mohawk, and so there's quite a bit of lean meat on here, so we want to make sure we protect that. Also, another thing to think about, yes, this is kind of the fattier piece, and yeah, it can take a little bit more heat, but more specifically on the opposite end of the brisket, so this corner right here, and on this big brisket, this corner on the inside is where that lean end, if it does start to curl up, that's where it would be. It'd be towards the center of the smoker where it's cooler. You're just giving another chance for it to survive by keeping away from the hot spots. Just another quick point that I want to make about the fire. People in backyard pits have a really hard time with their temps fluctuating. And for that reason is why I emphasize having the coal bed is really your consistent heat source, while throwing logs in there every now and then is adding the element of smoke. If you guys have that issue with temps really fluctuating, start with a really good coal bed, and that way you only have to add maybe 1 or 2 splits in your backyard pit. Don't feel like you have to build a fire like you've seen in everyone else's giant smokers, because it's not the same thing. There's just too much convection that's happening in the offset if you have a lot of logs in there, and you're just going to end up with something that's really dry and really crusty. Your fire has to be built the way that your smoker needs it to be. Yeah, those are the type of coals that we're looking for, nice and chunky. And look at this nasty piece right here. This thing is, honestly, if all of my logs came like this, where it has all these little knots and grooves in them and it's dry, it's perfect. We were sitting at about 255 on the back end right now, and it's going to slowly go up just a little bit, which is perfectly fine. With that being said, let's talk about cooking temps. I've worked with people who they like to be very specific of how they want their brisket cooks to be. For these hours, I wanted it at this temp. After we hit this certain amount of time, we're going to bump it up this much. Or there are other places that we're throwing in the briskets in a cold pit while the fire's building up so that we can get extra smoke on there. All that stuff, it works. I'm never ever gonna tell anybody like your method is, I mean, it might be strange, but it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, if it's what you like and you're comfortable doing it, then it's fine. But for those of you guys who are in your backyards and you just hear all this information, it's not very helpful sometimes. So I'm just gonna give you guys what I think when I'm thinking about all these temp ramps and stuff like that. Let's say one of the most popular ones is like, you know, starting at a really low temp at like 225. An hour or two later, you're at 235, then 245, then 250, 60, 70, 75. And it's just like, why? I was talking to someone that I was training. They told me that that is their method and that's what they were taught. And I'm never gonna step into anyone's place and be like, don't do that, because it clearly works. But I just asked the person, what's the difference between a fire that's at 220 to 230? But I don't know. And I don't think it really makes that much of a difference. And I said, yeah, I agree. So instead of having to stress yourself out being like, oh my god, I'm at like 227 now when I'm supposed to be like at least 220, 225, and then the next hour you're stressing out again just to be like, oh no, it dipped too low, now it's at, you know, 225 when it's supposed to be 230 plus. It just creates unnecessary stress. And like I said, in my opinion, it doesn't really matter. The duration of that time when you're slowly increasing from 220 to 270, Like the average temperature in that range is 250. If that's the goal, it would make a little bit more sense to just stay at 250 that entire time until that, you know, like, all right, my briskets reach a certain marker to where now it makes sense to bump up the temp a little bit to 270, 275. And that's the method that I use. That way you don't have to worry about, should it be higher or lower? It's like, no, we're just gonna cook this thing until it looks right, smells right, feels right. And then when it's time to really bump up the temp, because we know the briskets can handle it, that's when we're gonna do so. Alright guys, so we're about 3 hours in right now, and in terms of temp wise, we've been keeping it roughly about 250 to 260-ish or so. The edges right here towards the bottom and the sides, they feel really nice, like they're tightening up because that first initial part of that cook, that muscle is gonna tighten up a bit. I think this is when people start to worry a little bit of like, oh my gosh, my brisket is gonna be really, really tough, but it is gonna tighten up and then relax over time. One thing that I'll say though is the color is not exactly where I want it to be. I wish it was a little bit darker. I wish the fat was a little bit more yellow. Flesh itself, it's starting to get that nice mahogany color. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna bump up the temp just a little bit now. So after the first 3.5 hours, generally based off of my color development looks like and how it feels is when I'll determine whether or not I can sit at that temperature longer or if I need to bump it up. And in this case, I'll probably bump this thing up to 270 at this point. And we'll probably keep that there for another 2 to 3 hours, and I'll do another check to see again, do I need to bump it up again, or maybe do I need to bring it down? With this being a new pit, it's just really being able to figure out how this thing likes to cook, what temp does it like to sit at where it's cooking the way we need it to. But I'll say the one thing that's really nice though, if I flip this thing around right here, this is that edge that would normally curl up if it got too hot, but because we trimmed it and we rounded it, it's still curling a little bit. Before it was like sticking out a lot. If we just left that on, this entire piece would just probably just flake off and just be really, really dry. That's really why, again, we said it's really important to round off that corner. In terms of like foil tips, I know a lot of people have a question about when should you or do you even need to. In this case, because this is nice and rounded, I don't feel like there's anything that's there to really dry out or stick out. Also, there's not really anything for your foil to catch onto right there. So in my opinion, because the way we trimmed it the way we needed to, and our lean has a nice thickness to it, there's really no need for us to use foil tips. A lot of people ask me certain questions of how do I know if I'm ahead or behind? I don't really know until this is done. Hopefully you guys continue to ask yourselves when you do your next cook in your backyard, and just be observant of a lot of things. In terms of like the weight of the brisket and how that's starting to tighten up, that's also telling me that we did cook hot enough. Sometimes people cook too low. That part of that lean that's really thin is still kind of floppy. You don't really want that. This thing has been cooking for, you know, 3.5 hours now. And if it's still floppy, you probably cooked it way too low in the initial stages. All right, guys, so we're about 5.5 hours in. Much darker color. And I think that's happened definitely from bumping up that temp. And we got a little bit of pooling, but cool. Dump it. Yeah, looks good. The one issue that happens with the pooling is when you dump it and underneath it, a lot of the seasoning washes off. That's probably just because it continues to fill up really quickly, which is a sign of it being a little bit too hot. The corn actually feels really nice, so I don't think we'll need to cover that up. So as you saw in those briskets, we're starting to get some good color on there. And again, this has only been 2.5 hours since the last check, and just bumping up our temp up about 25 degrees more for the last 2.5 hours or so. Everything is kind of like in stages. Like I would say what we did initially, just to kind of gauge where our how our fire needs to be run, and just kind of like slowly bring the internal temp of that brisket up. That's kind of like stage 1. Right now we're in the stage 2 process, which is like majority of the brisket cook, and this is where we're really looking to develop color get really good bark formation on there, to just be careful that we're not pushing it too far by, again, looking at all the extra pooling that's happening. And I think though also the thing that you guys have noticed is they're starting to look a little bit more like wet on the outside. And I'm not talking about like we put a mop sauce on top, but as that fat on the outside starts to render a bit, it starts to get a little bit of a glossier look, and that's what we're looking for. And which is also why I tend not to spritz, because I feel like it's sort of kind of like self-base itself as that fat starts to render out. So as we keep going, probably gonna keep this temp around 275 to 280 for another, I want to say at least 2.5 to 3 hours or so, and that's usually when we're kind of getting close to thinking about whether or not we're getting close to wrap. In this particular video, we're just going to do a traditional butcher paper wrap, and then in other videos, like if we decide to do a foil boat or do other methods, I'll talk about different things I'm looking for. But for today, and specifically what we're trying to do with the butcher paper wrap, that's the plan. So we are just short of 9 hours in right now. The size of our briskets are pretty different. Like this one is way smaller than the ones up there and the one back there. You can see like how smushy that fat is on top, and that's what we're looking for. And if you could hear it too. Right, like I said, field test, sound test, all those kind of things check out. If I flip this brisket around, that spot where it used to pool, it's pretty dried out now. And the sides of the lean feel really, really soft and pliable. I would say this one is almost done. So honestly, for this one, I'm probably not gonna wrap it, but everyone always asks for like temp checks and stuff like that. So I'm gonna go at the very like middle and side of a lean, 187, and the point, 201, okay? Same texture on this one also. This one in the back doesn't feel as good, so that one definitely needs a little more time. Yep, the point on this one is 200, the lean around the same, 186. And I'm gonna attempt this back one real quick, and I'm gonna assume that, I don't know, this one still feels a little tight, and I'm sure it's about mid 160s, so it'll probably get to that 170 and bump up to like 175 within the next hour or so. It's like hovering right around 170, and then I'd say the point probably like mid 180s, maybe 190. Yeah, that one's 195. Okay, so we're gonna close this thing up. Again, this one right here, I'm just gonna leave until it's done, just because there's no reason for us to wrap. I love the texture on it, and so this is, I guess, like a trial run of doing a no wrap brisket. All right, guys, so with the two briskets up front, the two smaller ones, just because they don't really need that much, you know, the fat is really rendered, the leans are getting there, they'll probably take another hour or so until they're done. But the one in the back, obviously a lot bigger, but the fat on top didn't feel as smushy yet. It was still kind of like firmed and pressed against the point, and all that fat just kind of hasn't felt like it's started to render quite yet. Even though the internal being roughly around 170 or so, we could think that it is close to being wrapped if you decide to wrap it in butcher paper. But if that's not there and the fat isn't rendered yet, do not wrap. I only say that because once it's wrapped up, even though you might cook it for a couple more hours, you're not gonna have that convection running on top of that brisket anymore. So if you're looking for that golden fat, that process needs to happen before it goes into butcher paper. If you don't, you'll end up with that white fat that isn't quite rendered enough, and it's just not as good. Also at this time, let's say all my briskets were that large. The brisket has great color. It's kind of shrunken down to the size that we know it's gonna be, but it just needs a little bit more heat. And again, we've been cooking at like 175, close to 180-ish for the last couple hours. But just to ensure that when I bump up the temp a little bit more, because one, I want to bring the internal temp up on the meat, and also I want to render that fat, this is when I might come in with a spritz bottle, spray the surface of the briskets, not have it be wet. We just want it to be a little bit more damp so that when we introduce more heat with more convection, that the outside isn't just gonna dry out completely. That's probably the only time that I would say you kind of need it, is if you bump up the heat, you want to add a little bit more moisture just so it doesn't completely just singe on top. Another thing that a lot of people ask me about is temp ranges between the lean and the fatty. And I always tell people, well, it varies because it depends on how big your brisket is, how thick the lean is. Also kind of like how that point feels compared to lean, because sometimes that point feels like, dang, it's almost done and the lean is still rock hard. Those are a little bit harder to say, like based off of temp, that they should come off. It's right, everything's based off of feel. But I will say this, just because we got these two smaller briskets that we're not gonna wrap at all, I would say that in terms of my experience, again, I always check and probe briskets when I know that they feel good. And so for the lean, generally I like to get it above 200. I like to get it between 203 to 210, while the point, in my experience, can take a lot more heat. And so I can go up to about 214 on that point. Now, it doesn't always hit those high temperatures, but the thing about brisket is that point will be a little bit more forgiving at that higher temps when you pass that 210. Sometimes the lean just needs a little bit more time to kind of catch it to the point. And you might also be asking, you know, what about turning the leans towards the fire, away from the fire, and all that kind of stuff? To be honest with you, I've done both, and I don't find there to be a significant difference, but I also understand the psychology of doing so. So if you are doing it and it tends to work, then just stick with it because it's just working. And after a long cook, worrying about leans being tight and you're not sure, man, maybe I should go back to where the points are towards the fire, just do the same thing you've always been doing if you like it that way. But again, I hope that helps and gives you a little bit more breathing room to not just think that, you know, your points can only go up to 203, because 203 has been the magic number that a lot of people hear. But when they see 203 in the point, sometimes the leans aren't even at like 190 yet. And if you're worried about that, or you think you have to pull the brisket off just because the point's at 203, give yourself a couple more minutes, throw in a log, and then close that door for at least another 30-45 minutes to see how far that lean can catch up. All right, guys, so these two briskets are definitely done, and I'll just do a quick probe test. This is just at 200 and 203. Wow, this one cooked great, nice and even. 200 and 209 on this one. Still feel great. What I mean by that lean end feeling like kind of like squishy, if you can see my thumb right there, you can see how it's like sinking in there and almost looks like it would leave a thumbprint. That's what we're talking about. Same thing with this one, that lean end, nice and pliable. I would say probably the one thing I could have done, honestly, with these two is I probably could have trimmed them a little bit better. I feel like there's a little bit too much fat on the tops of both of these, but what can you do? But they're rendered enough, so, and I know they feel really nice and soft, so it might be a little fatty, but I know it'll be fat that tastes good. So we're still gonna wrap these up though, because these will be going into my oven, and I don't want to just be exposed to just dry heat and just dry out. All right, so we got these two pieces of paper. I'm gonna spritz in between them just so it sticks a little bit better. Just introducing a little bit of moisture to the wrap, that's all we're doing. Take this one. And just so that I can show you guys the wrap that I do, because some people always ask me how I do it or why I do it. I'm going to take this right here, pull it up, and then we're going to do the twist. And the twist side happens on that point side. So the reason why I do this twist is because on the back end, when we go to wrap it, it's nice and flush. Because instead of just going here and sideways like that, there's this kind of excess paper. Sometimes if you have this kind of extra pocket right here and it's not, the wrap isn't super tight, it can collect moisture and it could wash off some of your bark. Here, twist on the point side, and then the corners I'm going to just tuck underneath. Then I'm going to wrap the point side again because I want to make sure that this side is extra tight. And now going with the lean side. Now when we flatten out this paper, I want the width of the end of this paper to be the same width as my brisket. So when I roll it a bunch of times, it won't come to a point, it'll be nice and even. Make sure that this is flush, and then press it out. So you can kind of see this brisket is nicely wrapped, and then this is kind of like, I guess, like the runway for the rest of the brisket wrap. So once, pull it tight. Twice, and this excess right here. When I know I'm gonna have excess, this is normally what I do to make sure there's not any dangling paper, is I'm going to bring this butcher paper over on top of the brisket, and where that end meets, I'm gonna leave a crease there. Because what that's gonna do is Now when I roll it over, I know it's gonna be nice and flush, and all that excess paper is gonna be, again, the same width of that brisket. And with like a lot of stuff do you have to do it this way? Absolutely not. Why do I do it this way? Just because I practiced doing it this way so many different times. You just vibe with it, and it is your style how you do something. I'll let them rest for a little bit, and then they'll be held in my oven overnight. All right, at this point, I just checked the big brisket that's sitting in the back. It had all the checks and the same things that I'm looking for. That one I did not temp. That one I just kind of did by feel, and I just know what I'm looking for. The lean end is much thicker than the other two, so it feels a lot more dense, but the fat on top is starting to feel a lot more rendered, and so that's my indication of like, hey, it's go time, and I know that the lean end will loosen up in the wrap. Oh yeah. Yeah, this one looks great. Hope you can like hear that bark. That's what we're looking for. So the check for this brisket that we just wrapped up, that's gonna need more time, we're still doing the same exact checks later on. I'm mostly feeling for the bottom of the lean because I know for a fact that that point is probably almost done. But again, because the window for that point to be like good is much larger than the lean, what we're really waiting for is for that lean to soften up. So later on when we go to check it, I'm really just kind of flipping the brisket over upside down and just kind of poking the sides of the lean like I did with the other ones that I showed you. Lately, everyone's been either doing the foil boat method or just going with the no wrap method. And so I understand if you guys gravitate to those two, because those two options are great. I mean, we just did two of that are not wrapped in butcher paper for the cook, and they turned out great. But if you guys are gonna do this, when you go to check this brisket later, the one thing that I'll encourage you guys not to do is not to open the entire brisket and to really learn how to feel for the doneness of the brisket while it's still in the butcher paper. The more you let it out and the more you close it again and the wrapping gets looser and looser, the more you check it. There's something about introducing a lot of cold air to it, I feel like just changes the texture of the brisket. And I'm not sure if this is true, but this is how I felt like those cooks that I felt like those really big ones that we opened and closed a bunch because they just weren't getting done. They started tasting a little bit like more pot roasty, and the color of them was like kind of gray, even when we went to go slice it. I'm gonna let this ride for 300 to 320 or so, just within that hotter range. I just don't want it to dip below 300, and then we'll check on this in probably an hour and 45 minutes to 2 hours. And if we go check on it, it's not done and it's getting close, we'll let it go for another 20 to 30 minutes. This is just another tip for you guys, especially for those of you who are starting to do caterings and pop-ups and things like that. One of the biggest times I feel like you extend your cook is at this stage when, one, again, it's not ready to wrap or to be foil loaded, and then you force it into it because you're more worried that it's been cooking for X amount of time, so it has to be ready. That's not the case. You have to let it, make sure that the internal gets to a certain point, that the fat is rendered, and also that the brisket actually feels like it's ready to go. If you do it too early, the only thing that you're really gonna do, especially if you're using the butcher paper method, you're gonna allow extra steam to be incorporated in your cook because you didn't expel enough moisture. So later on, when you go to lift that brisket, it's gonna feel like there's extra water in there because all of that extra liquid that came out of the brisket is now left in the bag. Another tip that I always tell people as well is that when you're doing a bunch of briskets and you're still kind of learning how to wrap a little bit faster and you're not sure how long it's gonna take, have all your paper torn, make sure you have enough apple cider vinegar or whatever liquid in your spritz bottle, and just make sure you don't have to take care of anything else, because you don't want briskets that need to stay hot cooling down just because you're taking a really long time to wrap them. Before you start wrapping all your briskets, bump up the heat in your smoker. By the time you're done wrapping, you want to be able to take those briskets, put them in the smoker, and make sure they're cooking from then on. All right, folks, this is the one that we did the full paper wrap, the biggest one that we had. If you watched the trim video, this is the one where we did that the longer detailed one. In terms of like what I'm looking for, and I didn't get to show this earlier, but feeling for the brisket, I'm feeling for the bottom of the lean right here, and I'm pressing with my thumbs. And sometimes there are certain spots that feel a little bit tighter than others, and we're waiting for kind of all of it to feel pretty even. All right. That looks killer. Look at that. And again, with that side right there, that spot that usually curls up, nothing is curled up. It's not dried out because we cut off that edge. Now after that long rest overnight, everything is a little bit more tight. You know, I think most people get a little bit nervous when they're pulling briskets because they're worried that it's gonna shred apart like pulled pork. But you know, after that long rest, it does settle down into firmness that you want it to be. All right, let's get into slicing this brisket. Let's go with a nice cross section right here. That looks fire. Perfect. This is, again, just my preference. I do like having a little more fat on my lean. I think it just tastes really good with that leaner meat that has a little less intermuscular fat. Yeah, let's get a slice on this. One thing that I like to do when I'm slicing my brisket with the hand, my offhand that I'm holding it with, you know, you're putting pressure down here so that you can make sure it doesn't rock too much. As you kind of slice, you can kind of bring your hand down or bring your the palm of your hand down here so you can kind of get a good clearance and get a really good pull. So right here, I'll just move my hand down on that pole sometimes if I feel like I need it, and then boom, from there. Yes, sir. That's a really good, nice looking lean right there. Boom. Beautiful. This part's still part of that point, so the grains are going in a different direction, but here it is. Let's give it a taste test. I have a little bit of that point muscle, some of that fat. Oh yeah. Ooh, that's good. First, with this burn end, we're just gonna take off maybe an inch or so off the side. Yeah. That is what we're talking about. And again, you guys see that top of that brisket. It almost kind of looks like a foil boat type brisket. The bark really adhering to the surface of that point muscle. All right, now let's get a slice of this fatty as well. And this one we want to have it a little bit thicker. You know, I think some people make it a little bit too thick sometimes. This right here, that is what we're talking about. If you guys see all the way to the end right there, still right here on this edge, like it's obviously crunchy because it's exposed bark, but it is not dried out. You usually see at this point right here on the brisket where it starts to turn a little more gray or really dark brown because it's dried out, but nope, there's intermuscular fat all the way through there. It's nice and stretchy and springy. All right, let's take a bite. Oh yeah. And no spritz, no water pan, no nothing. It's still super juicy.
It was amazing. Say something to my wife, though. No. And me.
I love her, but no. Look at dude.
I knew I shouldn't have told him.
Shit.
I knew I shouldn't have told him.
Where are we going?
We're
I'll buy you a brisket as soon as you can make it.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, folks, so that's it. That's my entire brisket process. And as you guys can tell during this video, I did very little of showing you guys what is actually happening inside the pit, because to be honest with you, when you're cooking brisket, there's really no reason to look in your smoker at all. Do not open up that smoker. Just let it do its thing. And the purpose of me doing this video this way is to show you guys that spritzing very often kind of, you know, you don't really need to do it. We didn't have a water pan in there, so we didn't have to go back and fill it up every couple hours when it got dry. We didn't put foil caps on either the point end or the lean end. I wasn't going there often and stabbing the brisket with a probe just to figure out whether or not it was in or out of the stall. To me, the biggest things about cooking brisket are just a handful of things. Number one is practicing on your trim. And as you guys saw during my cook, the fat cap for me is a huge indicator of whether I know that my brisket is on the right track based off of the color, based off of how it's softening up, based off of how it's rendered on it towards the end of the cook. And second, and probably the most important part, probably when you cook anything for barbecue, is being able to manage your fire. It's so important. You can't have fluctuating temperatures when it's going from like 225 to 300 or 315 to 240. You know, it has to be within a certain range. And I think this video also showed the fact that like we did stuff in butcher paper that was cooked in the butcher paper, and then we did other ones that weren't, and they all felt exactly the same. They all kind of fit within the same temp ranges. It's not about whether or not you use butcher paper, whether you use foil boat, whether you just wrap it in foil or you don't wrap at all, because at the end of the day, we're all trying to get the brisket to the same point. So that's the end of this video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I'm sure a bunch of you guys have a load of questions for me after this, and there's going to be a lot of questions that I'm not going to be able to answer clearly because, like I said, a lot of stuff that I do is based off of feel, but I will try my absolute best. And if you guys are new to this channel, please make sure to subscribe and also hit that bell notification so you know when my next videos will come out. Yeah, if you guys enjoyed it, please make sure to like, subscribe, share this video with your friends, and I'll see you guys in the next one.